The thing about some houses is that from the street, they look exactly like safety. A single-story home on a quiet road in Northport, Florida, a trimmed lawn, a porch light that clicks on at dusk like clockwork. A driveway where the same car comes and goes, Sunday mornings marked by church clothes and to-go coffee. Neighbors remember the couple who lived there as friendly, kind, and the sort of people you wave over to mailboxes and see in the same pew almost every week. They went on mission trips, they posted Bible verses, and they brought a teenage boy home from another country and called it a miracle. For years, it was just another house with a cross on the wall and a family inside. Then, one late summer night, someone woke up to frantic pounding on their front door. A woman's voice, ragged with terror. "I need help. I need help." By the time the neighbor reached the door, whoever had been screaming was gone. What was left was blood on the steps and on the concrete, as if someone had tried to claw their way into safety and never quite made it. The 911 call, thick with confusion, brought police into the neighborhood. Patrol cars rolled down Malakote Road, headlights washing over identical houses, until they reached one particular driveway. A young man stood outside. There was blood on him. He got into a car and drove away into the dark. Behind him, in that quiet Florida house that used to look like safety, lay the people who had once flown across an ocean to call him their son. This is the story of a missionary couple who believed love could heal anything, the boy they brought home from a Ukrainian orphanage, and the night everything in that house on Malakote Road bled out onto the floor. This is the story of the evil orphan, the Dima Tower story. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Long before anyone heard the name Dima Tower on a true crime channel, Robbie and Jennifer Tower were just church people, the kind you see every week and assume will always be there. Jennifer Christine grew up in Ohio, the youngest of three sisters, the kind of kid who turned into the kind of woman people describe with words like gentle and steady. She loved bird watching, one of those quiet hobbies that tells you everything about a person's patience, the way they're willing to sit still and wait for something small and beautiful to appear. Robbie James Tower was the funny one. Friends and family remember his sense of humor, the way he could disarm tension with a joke, slide into the role of favorite uncle without even trying. He was the guy who would tease you just enough to make you roll your eyes and smile. Together, they moved to Florida and built a life that revolved around faith. Sunday services, midweek Bible studies, mission trips overseas. They weren't rich, they weren't flashy, just two people who believed, with almost reckless sincerity, that the point of being alive was to help. Like a lot of couples, they wanted children. And like a lot of couples, it didn't happen the way they expected. We don't have their private medical details, and frankly, we don't need them. What matters is that at some point, their desire for a family and their devotion to their church collided with a familiar pitch. There are children overseas who need homes. Missionaries from American churches have been flying to Ukraine for years, visiting state orphanages, bringing toys and clothes, painting walls, praying with children who spoke a different language, but understood exactly what it meant to have strangers show up for a week and then vanish. The Towers went. In 2016, Jennifer started posting photos from Ukraine, bundled up against the cold, standing in front of concrete buildings, surrounded by children who had learned how to pose for mission trip cameras. Somewhere in that gray landscape, she and Robbie met a 14-year-old boy named Dima. He wasn't anyone's idea of an easy adoption. He wasn't a wide-eyed toddler or a smiling elementary school kid. He was a teenager, a boy with the kind of history that leaves marks, even if you can't see them at first glance. His biological mother was said to be dead. His father, by relatives' accounts, struggled with alcoholism and had left him essentially to the mercy of the state. Dima had grown up in institutions described by people who'd seen them as like a prison for kids. Rows of beds, not enough food, not enough affection, just enough structure to keep bodies moving from one room to the next. When the Towers and their church group took him and other kids out for meals, they noticed things. The way he ate, fast and focused, as if someone might take the plate away before he was finished. They noticed the bruises, the hardness in his eyes that looks a lot like adulthood, but is really just childhood that has been over for a very long time. If you've never been inside that world, it's easy to underestimate what it means to be 14 and already convinced that no one cares about you. To Robbie and Jennifer, Dima wasn't a cautionary tale. He was a calling. Later that year, back in Florida and deep in the labyrinth of international adoption paperwork, they started talking about him as their son. They posted things like, "Pray for our boy," and "It's a boy" over Christmas, echoing the language of birth announcements with legal documents in place of ultrasound photos. They were not naive. They had heard the warnings about older kids, about trauma and adjustment, but they were believers in God, in redemption, in second chances, and they believed they could handle it. And so a teenage boy from a Ukrainian institution walked off an airplane into Florida sunshine and into the Tower's life. They gave him a room, and they gave him a bed that no one else would rotate into after he left for the day. They gave him a closet full of clothes that were only his. They gave him the words son and family, simple syllables that carry entire worlds inside them. If this were the kind of story churches like to show during Sunday services, this is where the montage would begin. You'd see Dima learning English, smiling awkwardly in family photos, playing games in youth group, going on beach outings, holding a Bible with his new parents in a pew. There would be uplifting music, a Bible verse about adoption, maybe a missionary slideshow. Real life, though, doesn't stay in montage mode for very long. Inside the house on Malakote Road, the Towers were learning what a file cannot tell you. They were learning what it means to live with a teenager whose brain has been shaped by abandonment and institutionalization, whose survival instincts are sharper than his trust, and whose nervous system has been calibrated by years of fight, flight, or freeze, with very little safe places. We know from police records that by the time Dima was legally an adult, things inside that house were breaking in ways that wouldn't show up in Christmas photos. Northport police were called to the home multiple times starting around 2018. In one incident, Jennifer reported that Dima had pushed her when she came into his room. In another, Robbie admitted to officers that he had started sleeping with his bedroom door locked at night because he was afraid of his own son. And let that image sit with you for a second. A man who had flown across an ocean to bring a boy home, now turning a simple interior lock every night, not to keep the world out, but to keep the person he had rescued away from his bed. In 2020, things escalated. According to reports, Dima was arrested on domestic violence charges after an alleged attack that left a family member with a bleeding forehead and injuries on their back. The case didn't ultimately result in a conviction. The charges were dropped, but the bruises were real, and the fear they left behind didn't evaporate just because a judge's gavel came down. Relatives later recalled that Robbie, trying to find some way to redirect what he was seeing, introduced Dima to boxing, hoping structured physical contact might turn into an outlet instead of an explosion. But even that came with red flags. People close to the family remember Dima saying he didn't just want to box, he wanted to hurt people. And yet, as these incidents accumulated, so did something else: forgiveness. The Towers were Christians in a very literal sense. Forgiveness wasn't just a nice idea for them, it was a commandment and a core practice. They believed in grace the way some people believe in wearing your seatbelts. It's just what you do. So when Dima lashed out, they forgave. When he scared them, they prayed. When police cars pulled away, they tried again. Relatives later told reporters that after prior incidents, Robbie and Jennifer forgave him for everything. They believed that love, time, and stability could still win out over whatever darkness had taken root in their son before he even knew their names. From the outside, if you were just a neighbor watching them carry groceries to and from the car, it still looked like a normal family with a slightly intense teenage boy. You wouldn't see the midnight anxiety, the quiet conversations about safety, the delicate dance between not wanting to give up on your child and not wanting to admit you might be in danger from him. But from inside the house, the fault lines were deepening. You had two people whose core belief was that no one is beyond redemption, and you had one young man whose emotional wiring had been shaped by loss, neglect, and a lifetime of learning that the way to feel powerful is to make someone else feel helpless. Those two forces, redemption and rage, were living under the same roof. Nothing on Malakote Road looked unusual from the street. But inside, the story was already drifting toward a conclusion no one wanted to imagine. By the time the calendar rolled over to August 31st, 2023, the house on Malakote Road had lived a lot of lives. It had been a honeymoon nest, a mission trip fundraising headquarters, a landing strip for jet-lagged travelers returning from Ukraine, a sanctuary for youth group kids eating leftover pizza at the dinner table. It had also been the scene of arguments, frightened phone calls, and at least one arrest. But on that particular Thursday night, it probably felt, at least for a little while, like any other end of summer evening in Florida. We don't know exactly how Robbie and Jennifer spent their last day. Maybe they ran errands, maybe they scrolled through social media, pausing over news from Ukraine as the war ground on. Maybe they thought about Dima, about his progress, about past fights or future plans. What we do know is that by late that night, they were home. Lights were off in most rooms, the familiar routine of a couple settling into sleep. And somewhere in that same house was their son. According to investigators, at some point that night, Dima moved through those rooms with a purpose only he fully understands. Prosecutors would later allege that he took a steak knife from the kitchen, an ordinary household object meant for dinner, not death, and walked towards the bedroom where his parents slept. The details of what happened next live in blood patterns, autopsy reports, and the way prosecutors would later reconstruct the sequence for a jury. But standing at the threshold of that moment, right before the first blow, before the first scream, before the first frantic scramble toward a neighbor's porch, you can feel how thin the barrier is between ordinary night and unspeakable. You know, there's always a version of the timeline in a crime where nothing happens, where someone goes back to their room, where the knife goes back into the drawer and everyone wakes up the next morning to coffee and plans. But that's never the version we're here to talk about. What we know is this. Sometime before midnight, a neighbor was jolted awake by pounding on her front door and a woman's desperate voice begging for help. By the time she reached the door, the woman was gone. Blood stained the front steps where a stranger had just been. The neighbor called 911, trying to explain the unexplainable. A scream and a knock, a vanishing, and a red trail left behind. Patrol cars rolled into the neighborhood, their lights cutting across the facades of houses that never expected to be lit up like that. Officers followed the blood back towards its source, to the house where they had been called before, not for noise complaints or loud parties, but for family violence. Outside that house, they saw a young man. He was moving things into a car registered in his name, and he had blood on him. Officers shouted commands. The young man didn't obey. He got into the car, turned the key, and tore away from the curb, leaving the house behind, leaving whatever was inside it unseen for just a little while longer. As he fled down Florida streets and onto I-75, police gave chase, turning a quiet suburban nightmare into a high-speed pursuit, tires screaming, sirens fracturing the humid night. Back on Malakote Road, behind the door he had left, in rooms filled with the echoes of everything that had led up to this night, mission trips, adoption papers, police reports, whispered prayers. Robbie and Jennifer lay where they had fallen. Their story for the moment was over. Dima's story, for better or worse, had only just spun out of their orbit and into the harsh gravity of the criminal justice system. And the house that once looked like safety from a street was about to become a crime scene that seasoned officers would struggle to describe without pausing for breath. While crime scene technicians worked the house, officers pursued Dima Tower. He led authorities on a high-speed chase on Interstate 75. Cops deployed spike strips to stop his vehicle, which caused him to abandon the car and escape on foot into a nearby wooded area. After an extensive overnight search lasting about 8 hours, Dima Tower was located and arrested the next morning. He was found on September 1st, 2023 at a Shell gas station on Knights Trail Road. A gas station manager recognized him from a description, noting his hands were dirty and blood-stained, and directed police to him behind the building, where he was apprehended without further incident. He's been in custody ever since, and the trial has just begun. Trials never start with drama, they start with logistics, microphones, nameplates, jurors staring into coffee cups. But underneath the fluorescent lights of a Sarasota courtroom, everyone knew this was not a routine murder case. This was the story of a missionary couple who forgave every red flag until their lives were taken from them. This was the story of an adopted boy from a Ukrainian orphanage, now a man on trial for killing the only people who ever tried to love him. On November 12, 2025, Florida v. Dima Tower officially began. Dima walked into the courtroom in a suit that did its best to age him up, make him look like a professional instead of a 24-year-old whose name had been linked to a double homicide for 2 years. He kept his head down. He blinked too often. I've been accused of that a lot. His fingers twitched with the restless energy of someone trapped in a body that doesn't know how to be still. The charges were read: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of fleeing law enforcement. If convicted of the top charge, he faces life in prison. And remember, Florida is a death penalty state. When the prosecution began their opening statement, they didn't warm up. They cut straight to the bone. They showed the jury diagrams of the house, the bedroom, the living room, and they described the knife, the ordinary knife that you use to cut a steak, and the way they believed he used it in a violent and sustained attack. First in the bedroom and then in the living room. Apparently, this was a very bloody crime scene. Attorneys told the jury that Jennifer had tried to escape and that she had made it to the neighbor's door. And we learned that Jennifer had fled to the neighbor's house looking for help, and then Dima came out of the house and grabbed her and forced her back into her own house. That is like something out of a horror movie, you know? The victim makes it out of the house, goes for help. It looks like they're on the verge of being saved, and then the killer drags them back to the murder scene before the help can come to the door. I mean, it is the stuff of nightmares. She was already injured, and she left blood on the steps, and then after he dragged her back into the house, he finished killing her. It also came out that Dima Tower was asked, "Why did you do this?" And he simply answered, "Rage." It's a simple word, but it's a heavy word, you know? And it is a word that jurors would hear again and again. I would really like to dig into the psychological profile of this kid. It's fascinating to me because, you know, here on Dark Hearts, we talk a lot about nature versus nurture. Are people born bad or are they made bad? And this case in particular really piques my interest with regards to that conversation. The defense came next. The attorneys did not argue that this didn't happen in that house. They didn't say it wasn't horrific. They didn't try to turn the jury into detectives searching for other suspects or mysterious intruders. They didn't claim fabrication or conspiracy or anything flashy. Instead, they argued the law, intent and premeditation. The difference between murder and manslaughter can often lie in premeditation. The defense attorneys told the jury about a boy abandoned by his parents, raised in institutions that starved him of affection. They described trauma deep enough to rewire the human brain. And they said that Dima was a damaged young man, not a monster, and that his actions were the eruption of decades of emotional injury, not some cold, calculated plan. Now look, we talk about this a lot here too. A lot of people have deep, life-changing trauma. A lot of people do not slaughter their parents with a steak knife. But while Dima's attorney spoke, he began to cry. He wasn't sobbing, he just kind of collapsed in the shoulders, and you could hear him kind of crying under his breath. It was like he was trying to hold it in, and the judge paused because he saw the jurors were watching. And for a brief, kind of surreal moment, the boy who had been painted as a killer looked like what he had once been, a hurt child. But a trial doesn't stop because of that. The courtroom isn't built for emotion. It's built for evidence. Crime scenes tell stories long before lawyers do, and the story told by the house on Malakote Road was brutal. Prosecutors called the first wave of witnesses: crime scene technicians, forensic analysts, patrol officers, EMTs, and then of course there was the neighbor who woke to pounding and screaming. She opened her door to see a pool of blood and then made that 911 call. Jurors listened as she described the moment she realized the blood wasn't a fluke or, a cut finger or the kind of injury you can fix with a towel. This was somebody gravely injured that was begging for help. Then the officers testified. One described finding blood in the bedroom. Another described the living room where Robbie and Jennifer were found lying head to head, face down, and the floor saturated beneath them. Another cop talked about the stains on the couch and the front door, the kitchen, and there was apparently a rag in the sink. Every detail pressed harder into the jurors' minds. This wasn't quick or clean. It was chaotic and it was violent in multiple rooms of the house. They traced the blood trail outside, explaining the difference between walking and running based on the spacing of drops. And then they played the dash cam footage, the chase, weaving in and out of lanes, the fire trucks and cop cars whining, and the moment stop sticks shredded rubber and flung sparks into the night. They showed video of a figure fleeing into the woods, and then they saw the Shell gas station footage, the gas station where Dima was caught.
Julie, thank you. A man suspected of stabbing to death a Northport couple is now in custody after a search early this morning.
ABC Action News reporter Rebecca Petit with more on the double homicide investigation.
Just nice people. I mean, they were community people.
A Northport community is in shock after police find a couple stabbed to death inside their home. Police believe it was at the hands of 21-year-old Dima Tower. Investigators say shortly before midnight on Thursday, officers were called out to a disturbance on Malakote Road. That's where officers found a man and woman dead inside a home with multiple stab wounds. They also saw Tower getting into a vehicle.
Appeared to be putting some things in a car, and our officer gave commands to stop. That individual got in the car and took off at a high rate of speed.
Police chased Tower as he drove north on I-75 before he got out of the vehicle and ran into the woods. He was found roughly 7 hours later at a gas station near I-75 in Laurel Road. Police say Tower and the victims lived together as a family unit. Neighbors tell me the couple was well known in the community.
They kept an eye on the community. They kept an eye on the neighborhood. They were the first ones to greet us when we came here and welcome us to the neighborhood.
Melissa Willits has lived in the neighborhood for nearly 2 decades and says another family-related murder happened here several years ago.
I've seen the people over 15 years walking their dogs around the neighborhood. And so, I mean, yeah, it is heartbreaking that it could happen so close to home twice now in several years.
Police tell me Tower was arrested back in 2020 following a domestic incident. In Northport, Rebecca Petit, ABC Action News.
They also saw his arrest photos. He had this blank stare, very flat affect, almost detached from what was going on. and it shows some of the officers trying to speak with him and getting nothing in return. Piece by piece, the prosecution stitched together a narrative, a violent outburst, a failed escape, a capture, and then the defense countered, but not with surprises. They didn't claim he hadn't run or that he hadn't been covered in blood. They didn't claim someone else committed the murders. But they did point to the 2018 domestic incident where Jennifer reported being pushed and the 2019 report where Robbie confessed to locking his bedroom door at night. As I was watching the trial, I thought, the defense better be careful here because it could very easily come off as victim blaming. Like they knew this kid was violent and they kept him in the house. That would not play well with a jury. And then they talked about the 2020 arrest that ended up with a family member bleeding but no conviction. And they painted these years not as signs of an escalating killer, but as evidence of a deeply traumatized young man whose emotional regulation was permanently shattered long before he ever set foot in Florida. One of the defense attorneys actually said, trauma is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. Now, you can't really use it as an explanation if you don't also rely on it for an excuse to some extent. The prosecution argued that plenty of children survived neglect without murdering the people who tried to help them. They said Dima's background wasn't only a tragedy, it was a prelude. There were two stories, both rooted in pain. Only one side could win. When trials end, it's easy for the public to move on. News cycles churn, podcasts jump to the next case, and the internet forgets. But the people who loved Robbie and Jennifer don't get to leave the courtroom when the cameras shut off. Their loss is permanent. Jennifer, this beautiful mom who found joy in the small things, a feather in the yard, birds perched on the fence. And Robbie, both of these people are younger than I am. He's a man whose smile had a way of, making warmth in a room. They say that his faith was not performative. They say these people lived everything that they believed. And as an agnostic person, I would love to see more Christians like this. They weren't naive. They weren't reckless saints stumbling blindly into danger. They were two people who believed they could love someone into healing. Maybe they were wrong, but they weren't foolish. They were hopeful. And hope is a very dangerous thing to lose. Their house is now a property with a reputation. A home they saw as joyful became violent. The church they once attended has empty spots where the family used to sit. And Dima sat in a courtroom as lawyers argued over decades of his life, trying to sort out whether what happened was murder or manslaughter, intention or eruption, evil or trauma. Just days ago, on November 14th, 2025, after about an hour and a half of deliberation, Dima Tower was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the stabbing deaths of his adoptive parents, Robbie and Jennifer Tower. Following the verdict, he was immediately sentenced by Sarasota Circuit Judge Thomas Krug to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 5 years in prison for fleeing to elude police. When you strip away everything that happened at the trial, we're left with something painfully simple. 2 people tried to save a boy, and that boy grew into a man who shattered the world that they built around him. We can argue forever about what could have been done differently, therapy, boundaries, residential treatment, but none of those things bring them back. And none of it rewrites the final truth carved into that quiet Florida street. Sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes forgiveness becomes a doorway with no return. And sometimes the people who try the hardest to save someone end up the ones who cannot be saved themselves. Tough story today. I want to send love from the Dark Hearts community to everyone who has lost Jennifer and Robbie. It's just a tragic story all the way around. I appreciate you staying with me through it today. If you want more true crime stories, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to support me. This is my podcast. It's on Apple and Spotify. I post brand new episodes every Monday and Wednesday. And don't forget about our fundraiser. If you watch this video on my playlist entitled Fundraisers, it will explain everything we are doing to raise money for cold case DNA testing. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dark Hearts with Stacy Lee. Bye.